Now let's translate all this theory to a practice. Let's go to Spring Initializer and let's create a new project. So I will select Maven as project type or project manager, and then let's use the most recent version of Spring, which is 3.2.0, and Java language, of course. Here I'm gonna change this to com.alibu, and then as an artifact I will call it batch. So the description is a demo project for Spring Boot batch processing. Alright, so here let's keep it jar and Java 17. Now let's add few dependencies. So the first thing I will need web. I want to create a simple endpoint to start or invoke my job. And then I will need Spring Batch, of course. So here when you search for batch, you have Spring Batch and it's part of the IO. And then we need, of course, PostgreSQL because we want to persist some data to our database. And then we need, of course, Lombok to reduce the boilerplate code. All right, so now our project is ready. Let's click on generate and open our project within our preferred IDE. For the sake of this tutorial, I will be using IntelliJ Ultimate version. So you can also use the community because it's totally enough for you. You don't need to have the Ultimate version. All right, so let's go ahead. So here we have our project open in our IDE. So the first thing, let's go and add some configuration. So you know my style already. So I want to use, or I prefer using YAML configuration. And the first thing that I want to configure for my project is the database connectivity. I want my application to be able to connect to a database and to persist data there. So I will provide you the configuration and I will explain them one by one. And also if you are new with Spring Data JPA, I would like to recommend going back to my channel and checking the Spring Data JPA playlist. Alright, so this is our configuration. So we want to configure our data source, and here we have the URL, and I want to use a database called file upload. And then for the username and password, you can use username and password, or also you can change that to the corresponding one. So I will make it Alibu because my database is already configured like that. And then you need to specify the driver. Well, this one is optional. So you don't need to provide it because Spring will automatically detect the driver that we have in our pom.xml and it will use this driver, but it is also fine to provide or to specify the driver here. So also here, this is my JPA configuration and I want to have a DDL auto of type create drop and show SQL false. And here I want to format SQL true in case I decide to show the SQL. And now I precise the database, which is PostgreSQL. You can use a different one if you want to. And here just providing the dialect, which is PostgreSQL dialect. All right, so now our database is configured and Spring will be able to connect to our database. Then when starting with Spring Batch, we explained earlier that Spring Batch needs to create a schema or to create few tables in order to store and keep track of the job executions and the step executions, generally speaking. So in order to do that, we need to ask Spring Batch to what to do in order to initialize or to create the schema. So here we have several options. Whether we can ask Spring Batch to always create the schema, or we want to create our own and just tell him you can use the schema because automatically it will try to find the correct tables and use them. So here I need to provide a property called batch. And then we have another property called JDBC. And after that, we have a property called initialize schema. And for this initialize schema, we have always, embedded, or never. So embedded means that it's provided, never, so do nothing with the schema, and always means that we want Spring Batch to always initialize the schema in case it does not exist. So for now, I will keep it to always as a value. And then there is one important property. So Spring Batch is enabled by default, as you can see here. So Spring Batch is automatically enabled. So execute or Spring Batch jobs in the context. And this is something that we don't want to do. We want to trigger the execution of the jobs ourselves. So let's set this one to false. Alright, next I just want to change the server port to 9090, for example. And that's it. Now our project is configured. The next step is we want to move on and prepare the connection to our database. This step you can skip it if you want to. Alright, so for people using the ultimate version, you have this option right here, database. You can click on it and then you have this plus and you can add a new data source. So let's search for PostgreSQL, and now we need to provide the configuration or the properties in order to connect to PostgreSQL. So first let's keep everything as it is because it's already installed locally on the port 5432, and now I need to provide the username and password. And then just click on test connection. So now let's apply, and in case you see this warning, so this warning like database PostgreSQL has a collation version mismatch, I will show you how to fix that. So I'm gonna click OK. So in case you see that warning, so here you see that we are able to connect to our PostgreSQL, and in case you see that warning, all you need to do is to update or refresh the version. So there is a query you need to execute, which is alter collation, and then the collation name, which is PostgreSQL, and then refresh version. So if you run this command or this query right here, it will automatically update the collation version or the version that you have, and you will no longer see that warning. All right, so now let's go ahead and create a new database, and let's call it, as we mentioned in here, file upload. So file-upload, and then let's click OK. And here I will just keep only the file upload schema, and I want to display the public one. So here we have our database ready and our application is correctly configured, and now we are ready to start coding. So let's move on. So earlier we said that a batch processing application is composed of the following. So we have a job execution, and then it will launch or start a job, and a job is composed of one or many steps, and each step has three different items, which is item reader, item processor, and item writer. So now let's move on and do this, but we will do it from the bottom to the top. So this means we will start creating the items, the item reader, processor, and writer, and then configuring the step. Next, we will configure the job, and then we will start or launch our job. All right, so first thing, new class, and I will call it, or like make it in a package called config, and I will call it batch config. So in order to make this class as a configuration class, we need to add the configuration annotation, and I will also add the required args constructor from Lombok in order to inject or create my constructor for me. All right, so we said that within a step we have three things: reader, processor, and writer. So, and since we want to read a file and upload the data to a database, what we want to do is to create an item reader that will allow us, or will help us read data from a file. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So for this, we will need to create a bean. And this bean, we have an object or an implementation called flat file item reader. And this, we need to specify what is the object. So for now, I will keep it as an interrogation mark, and I will create the object in just a few seconds. So I will call this one item reader, for example. And for that, we need to return an item reader. But before doing that, let's go ahead and see what is this class. So always click on download source so you can see and read everything. All right, so here you see that this flat item reader already extends this class and implements this interface. And then also it extends item stream reader. and this one extends item reader. So as you can see, this implementation is already an implementation of the item reader. And if you click here, you will see all the available implementations that you might need. So here, for example, we have Mongo paging item reader, Mongo cursor item reader, and so forth. And the one we'll be using is this flat item reader because we want to read a CSV file that we will upload to our database. All right, but before going ahead and starting implementing this item reader, here we need to specify an object. What is the type of the data that we want to read? So here we can leave it as an interrogation mark, and we need to deal with the data, the typing, casting, and so on and so forth. Or we can simply create a class and use this class as a type. So I will create here a class student, and I will move it to a package called student. So here, as you can see, I have my new package student, and inside this student, I have the student class. So let's go ahead, and for this student class, let's give it some attributes. And first, we want to have a private integer ID. So this will be also our entity that we want to persist to our database. And then we will have private string first name, and then we will have also last name, and for example a private integer or int age. All right, so these are the attributes. Now let's add some annotations. We need another getter annotation from Lombok. We need also the setter annotation, and we need the entity annotation. All right, so the entity is not available because we did not add the Spring Data JPA dependency. So let's do it manually. Now let's go to our pom.xml, and here let's add a new dependency. And here let's type Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. And now all you need to do is to refresh the project, and this dependency will be available in our class path. So now we can import the annotation entity. All right, of course, within an entity, we need to provide an ID. And this one, I wanted also to be a generated value. So now I have my student object. Let's go back and continue our batch configuration. All right, now let's create an object of type flat file item reader of type student. And then let's call it item reader equals new flat item reader. And then we need, for our item reader, we need to set the resource. So from which resource we will be reading the file. So here in this case, we will be using a new file system resource, and now we can provide the path to our file. So generally, when we talk about batch processing, maybe you will mention, or you want to mention, that you want to upload a file from your API or from your front end and then process it. So batch processing is mainly when we want to have some scheduled jobs. So for example, we have a bunch of files or a list of files, and we want to process all the data or all the items, for example, every day at midnight. All right, so what you can do is to upload the file and then place it or send it to some location. And here the file or this item reader can read the file from that specific location. So, but for the sake of this course, let's give it this path. So I want to place my file here under src main and then resources, and then I will create here a file. So let's do it now, and let's call it, for example, students or student.csv. All right, now I can copy the path of this one and paste it in here. All right, so this is the path of the file that I want to read. After that, let's give our item reader a name. So we can set a name in here, and now let's call it CSV reader, for example. All right, so after giving it a reader, so here within a CSV file, so we will have here a header. So for example, it will be ID, first name, last name, and age. And now when reading the file, we can decide how many lines we want to skip. So we can tell the item reader .skip lines or set lines to skip. And we can say we want to skip only one line. All right, so this means we don't want to read from the header, but just from the next line. And then for this line, we need to set a mapper. So here we need to set a line mapper, and this line mapper, it will be a method that we will create in just few seconds. So here I will say line mapper, as a method, and I will create it just right now. Then all I need to do now is to return my item reader. So this is the item reader and it's ready now. Now all we need to do is to create our line mapper. All right, so for the line mapper, I will create a private method here. So it will be of type line mapper, and this line mapper will take and return a student. Okay, so let's call it line mapper. And then what we need to do, we have an object called default line mapper of type student, and let's call it line mapper equals a new default line mapper. Then we need to set our delimited line tokenizer. So it's this object here, and it's from the org Spring Framework batch item file transform. So here let's call it line tokenizer equals new delimited line tokenizer. And this for line tokenizer. So here let's set the delimiter. So what are the delimiters of my CSV file? So my data, for example, are separated or are comma separated. So for example, let's say that my student file or my student CSV looks exactly like this. So first I will have the header, I will have ID, and then first name, and then I have last name, and then I have age. So for example, here I have the ID 1, and then I have John, and I have Doe as a last name, and let's say 25. So the delimiter we are setting is this one, how we can separate the different columns. So then I will set another property. I will tell it if it's strict or not. So it will be no. So I will set it to false. And then I want also to set my line tokenizer dot set names. So what are the names of my elements or of my different columns? So here I have the ID, and then we have our first name, and then last name, as we mentioned in the CSV file exactly. So, and then finally we have age. So after that, we need another object of being wrapper field set mapper, and this one is of type student. So let's call it field set mapper equals new bean wrapper field set mapper. So I will explain what is this exactly. So this wrapper field set mapper is an object that will allow us and help us to transform each line that we will read from the CSV file to a student object. All right. So here, let's say field mapper dot set target type, and we need to provide a class. So it is our student dot class. All right, and finally, let's give our line mapper dot set line tokenizer, our line tokenizer we just implemented, and finally we say our line mapper dot set field mapper, which is our field mapper, the object we just created, and finally let's return our line mapper. So this is the line mapper method that will transform or that will map each line of our file here to a student object. So this is the main object or the main goal of this line mapper. All right, so now we are done with the item reader. Let's move on and implement our item processor. For the item processor, I want to show you how to have your own implementation. So for that, I will create a class in here, and I will call it student processor. And this class, in order to make it an item processor, we need to implement one interface. So here I will say my student processor implements an item processor as we explained before. And as you can see here, an item processor takes an input and an output. So what is the input? So our input is of type student, and the output, for now, just for the sake of this example, it's also of type student. But in a real world project, for example, you will receive some data and you want to map it and save it to a different format or a different table. For example, receiving a list of persons containing a bunch of information, and then you want to map that one to a student, subjects, and so on and so forth. So, but for now, we just want to make it and keep it simple in order to be able to simply digest this one or this explanation. So that's why we will have the input student, and also the output will be the student itself. So here, as you can see, we have a method called process, and all the business logic goes here in order to transform your data or to process your data. So let's rename this one to a student, and here we will simply return our student object. So let's keep our student processor simple. Now let's go back to our configuration, and the same way as we defined our item reader, we want to define a bean of type item processor. So our item processor is our student processor. So student processor, and let's call it processor. And all we need to do is to return a new student processor. So that's it with the processor. Now we need to configure or to create a bean for our next element or next phase of the step, which is the writer. So the writer is the bean or the class or the implementation, you call it whatever you want, that will write the data to some system, whether it can be a database, it can be a file, it can be, for example, a bucket in the cloud, and so forth. So all we need to do is to provide our processor. Okay, so in order to do that, let's first create a bean, and then let's create a bean of type public repository item writer, and then what we want to write an object of type student, which is our entity as well. So let's call it write, and then what we want to do here, we need to provide an object of type repository item writer, again of type student. I will call it writer, and then equals new repository item writer. So now I need to provide few information. So for this writer, I need to set the repository. So what is the repository? And as you can see here, it's a crude repository of type student. So for now, all I need to do is to inject private student repository, and I will call it repository, or we can also call it student repository. So for now, we don't have this repository. Let's go ahead and generate it. So I will create an interface, and I will place it in the student package. Now this interface, in order to make it a JPA interface, all I need to do is to do extends JPA repository of type student, and then my ID is of type integer already. Now, if I go back here, I have my repository, and I need the final keyword in order to ask Lombok to generate a constructor with this parameter. All right, so now let's go back. Let's set our repository. And then within the writer, what is the method that we want to execute? So set method name. And here we want to execute the save method of our repository. So just remember, when you have repository dot, you have also this save method. And then let's return our writer.